In Navajo tradition, the word Yi-na-lushi is spoken with such caution that many avoid saying it aloud at all. When a name itself is treated like a doorway, curiosity and fear become impossible to separate. That unsettling boundary is only the beginning. Across North America, dozens of enduring mysteries remain scattered through ancient ruins, sacred landscapes, unexplained artifacts, vanished peoples, and stories that refuse to fit neatly into archaeology or folklore. This collection brings together 22 of the most perplexing cases, questions that have challenged researchers, preserved oral traditions, and lingered long after evidence should have settled them. Some are debated, some are overlooked, and none have simple answers. The high deserts of the American Southwest stretch for hundreds of miles beneath an immense sky. Red sandstone cliffs rise above dry washes, juniper trees cling to rocky hillsides, and distant mesas seem almost untouched by time. As daylight fades, the landscape changes character. Long shadows erase familiar landmarks, coyotes call across the valleys, and the silence becomes so complete that even a gentle breeze seems unusually loud. It is a place where the natural world feels vast enough to conceal stories that outsiders may never fully understand. Within this landscape lies the homeland of the Navajo Nation, one of the largest indigenous territories in North America. Here, history is preserved not only in archaeological sites and written records, but also through generations of oral tradition. Many of those traditions are openly shared, while others remain intentionally private, protected because they carry spiritual significance or are considered inappropriate to discuss casually. Among the most widely known and most widely misunderstood is the figure often translated into English as the Skinwalker. The Navajo word most commonly associated with the legend is Yi-na-lushi, often translated as, "with it, he goes on all fours." According to Navajo cultural understanding, this term does not describe a mythical monster in the way popular culture often imagines one. Instead, it refers to a person who has chosen to violate profound spiritual and moral laws in pursuit of harmful supernatural power. Traditional accounts portray such individuals as witches capable of deception, manipulation, or, in some stories, taking on the appearance or characteristics of animals. What is striking is not simply the stories themselves, but the caution surrounding them. Many Navajo people avoid discussing skinwalkers altogether, especially outside appropriate cultural contexts. Some believe speaking about them unnecessarily invites fear or misfortune, while others simply regard the subject as deeply personal and sacred rather than entertainment. For many elders, the reluctance is less about confirming extraordinary claims than about respecting traditions that have survived centuries of upheaval. That distinction has often been lost beyond Navajo communities. Over the past several decades, books, films, internet forums, and television programs have transformed the Skinwalker into something very different. It has been portrayed as a shape-shifting monster lurking beside highways, an unstoppable predator with glowing eyes, or even an explanation for paranormal encounters ranging from mysterious lights to unexplained disappearances. These versions borrow fragments of authentic tradition, but frequently combine them with ideas drawn from horror fiction, cryptid folklore, and modern paranormal culture. Historians and anthropologists generally caution against treating these popular versions as accurate representations of Navajo beliefs. Oral traditions evolve over time, and many sacred teachings were never intended for public interpretation. Furthermore, much of what circulates online comes from anonymous stories that cannot be verified and often contradict one another. Yet the persistence of these accounts raises an interesting question. Why has this particular tradition captured so much attention? Part of the answer may lie in the landscape itself. The deserts and canyons of the Southwest possess an undeniable atmosphere of isolation. Travelers crossing remote highways after sunset sometimes describe strange sounds, unexpected animal encounters, or fleeting silhouettes that disappear before they can be identified. Under conditions of darkness, fatigue, and unfamiliar surroundings, ordinary events can become deeply unsettling. Psychology offers well-established explanations for how expectation, fear, and limited visibility influence perception. Still, not every story fits neatly into that framework. Across decades, individuals from remarkably different backgrounds have described experiences they insist defy simple explanation. Ranchers have reported animals behaving in unsettling ways. Drivers have recalled figures appearing briefly along deserted roads before vanishing into the darkness. Others describe an overwhelming sense of being watched in places where no one else seemed to be present. These experiences remain anecdotal, impossible to verify after the fact, yet they continue to circulate with surprising consistency. Some researchers have suggested that the Skinwalker legend functions primarily as a moral warning, a cultural reminder about the consequences of greed, broken trust, and the abuse of spiritual knowledge. Others wonder whether recurring stories preserve memories of practices or historical conflicts whose original meanings have gradually faded over generations. More speculative theories venture into paranormal territory, proposing that at least a handful of encounters represent genuine unexplained phenomena. None of these interpretations has produced evidence capable of settling the debate. Perhaps that uncertainty explains why the legend endures. It exists at the intersection of history, spirituality, culture, and human imagination, where documented facts give way to beliefs that cannot be measured by archaeology or laboratory tests. The deserts of the Navajo homeland have witnessed centuries of change, yet some stories remain remarkably resistant to certainty. Whether the Skinwalker is understood as a sacred cultural tradition, a misunderstood symbol, a cautionary tale, or something that still escapes conventional explanation depends largely on where one stands, and on how much of the night one is willing to leave unexplained. We've just seen how one native tradition survives by deliberate silence, protected precisely by what a community chooses not to say. Not every sacred story follows that pattern. Travel east from Navajo land onto the plains once thick with bison herds, and you find the Lakota people telling a story that has done nearly the opposite, carried forward openly, generation after generation, as one of the most sacred teachings a community can pass down. The core narrative, as it has been shared publicly by Lakota tradition keepers, tells of a time of hardship and hunger among the people, when two scouts encountered a mysterious woman on the plains, dressed in white buckskin, radiant in a way that immediately marked her as something beyond the ordinary. One scout approached her with impure intent and was consumed, according to the tradition, by a cloud or by lightning, a fate reflecting the seriousness of the encounter. The second scout, respectful and humble, was instructed to return to his people and prepare for her arrival. When she came to the camp, she brought with her the chanunpa, the sacred pipe, and taught the Lakota the 7 sacred ceremonies that would organize their spiritual life from that point forward. Before departing, she transformed, rolling on the ground and becoming, in sequence, a black, then brown, then red, then finally a white buffalo calf, before disappearing over the horizon. This is not a fragment recovered from obscurity, the way so much of what we've traced across this history has been. It is a living tradition, actively practiced and taught, central to Lakota ceremonial life today. And that is precisely what makes the questions surrounding it different in character from the mystery we just left behind. The question here is not what has been withheld, but rather, what does this story's endurance and its recurring physical echo across generations actually mean? Because the tradition does not end with a single ancient telling. It continues to intersect with the present in a way few origin stories do. White buffalo, animals born with a genetic condition or breeding lineage producing white or near-white coloring, exceptionally rare among American bison, have been born at documented intervals across recent decades, and each birth has been met with significant attention and reverence from Lakota and other Plains nations. Miracle Moon, born in Michigan in 1994, drew visitors from across the country. More recently, a white buffalo calf born in Yellowstone National Park in June 2024 was treated by many Indigenous leaders as an event of profound spiritual significance, understood by some as a fulfillment or echo of the prophecy tied to white buffalo calf woman's original visit. How should we understand the genuine rarity of these births set against the cultural weight immediately placed upon them? Wildlife biologists can explain the birth of a white bison in straightforward genetic terms. A recessive trait, occasionally expressed, statistically uncommon, but not supernatural in mechanism. That explanation is not disputed by Lakota tradition keepers, many of whom hold both understandings simultaneously without treating them as being in conflict. The biological mechanism explains how a white calf is born. It does not, in their framework, explain why it happens when it happens, or what its arrival means for the community witnessing it. This is where the documentary lens has to move carefully, because there is a real difference between examining the historical origins of a story and evaluating the truth of a living faith tradition still practiced by real people today. The Lakota Nation has long asked outside media and researchers to treat the white buffalo calf woman tradition with the same respect any established religious tradition would receive, not reduced to folklore or curiosity, and not treated as raw material for outside interpretation. Serious scholars of Lakota history and religion generally follow that guidance, working from what tribal historians and spiritual leaders have chosen to share publicly, rather than speculating beyond it. What can be said, from a historical rather than a theological angle, is that the tradition appears to be genuinely ancient, predating any recorded contact with European settlers, and that the sacred pipe ceremony it describes remains one of the most consistently documented and continuously practiced elements of Lakota spiritual life across the entire span of written contact with outside observers. A continuity relatively rare among oral traditions of comparable age anywhere in the world. That continuity itself invites a quieter kind of reflection than the archaeological mysteries examined earlier in this history. This is not a lost civilization or a vanished language, reconstructed from fragments after the fact. It is a story still being told by the people who have always told it, still shaping ceremony, still finding what many regard as physical confirmation in the rare births that continue, unpredictably, generation after generation. What does it mean that a tradition this old continues to intersect so directly with the present? And how many other stories, carried forward not through archaeology, but through unbroken living practice? Are we still only beginning to understand on the terms of the people who have always understood them? Follow the Lakota tradition east again, out of the plains and into the forested ridgelines of the southern Appalachians, where a very different kind of story has circulated among the Cherokee for generations. One concerning not a sacred visitor, but a people said to have occupied this land before the Cherokee themselves ever arrived. The tradition describes a group referred to as the Moon-Eyed people, said to have small stature, pale skin, and eyes so sensitive to daylight that they could see clearly only at night or during the dim light of a full moon. According to Cherokee oral accounts recorded by outside observers as early as the late 18th century, this earlier population was already established in the region when Cherokee ancestors arrived, and was driven out or destroyed following conflict, sometimes said to have occurred around the time of a full moon, from which the name is drawn. The earliest documented mention of the tradition in written form comes from Benjamin Hawkins, a U.S. Indian agent working among southeastern tribes in the 1790s, and the story was later elaborated by the historian John Haywood in the early 19th century. Both wrote as outside chroniclers recording what they were told, rather than as Cherokee tradition keepers speaking in their own voice. An important distinction, since it means much of what circulates today has passed through non-native hands, transcribed, translated, and in some cases reshaped, before ever reaching wider audiences. What makes the Moon-Eyed people story more than a passing folk tale is its frequent association with specific physical, still existing structures. Fort Mountain, in what is now Murray County, Georgia, features an ancient stacked stone wall nearly 900 feet long, running along the mountain's summit, of genuinely uncertain age and original purpose. Local tradition in the region has, for generations, connected this wall to the Moon-Eyed people, framing it as either a structure they built or a site tied to the conflict that supposedly ended their presence in the area. Archaeological investigation of the wall has been limited, and its precise date and function remain genuinely unresolved among specialists. Some propose it served a ceremonial purpose, others a defensive one, and the uncertainty itself has left ample room for the older oral tradition to remain attached to the site. Mainstream historians and folklorists generally treat the Moon-Eyed People narrative as one example of a broader, well-documented pattern found across many indigenous oral traditions worldwide. Origin stories describing an earlier, distinct population inhabiting a region before the ancestors of those now telling the story arrived. Such narratives often serve to explain existing physical features in the landscape, mysterious structures, unusual formations, while also situating a people's own arrival within a deeper, layered timeline of habitation. Under this reading, the Moon-Eyed People may represent a genuine folk memory of earlier, distinct inhabitants of the southern Appalachians, quite possibly connected to the well-documented pre-Cherokee mound-building cultures of the region, filtered and reshaped over generations of retelling into the more distinctive, physically unusual form recorded by Hawkins and Haywood. Here, however, the history of this particular legend takes a turn worth noting carefully. Beginning in the 19th century and continuing in various forms since, the Moon-Eyed People story was seized upon by outside writers and promoted as evidence for a pre-Columbian Welsh expedition to North America, tied to the entirely unsubstantiated legend of Prince Madoc, a claim with no credible historical or archaeological support, but one that gained popularity in service of a specific and troubling agenda: minimizing indigenous achievement by attributing ancient structures in the Americas to European visitors instead. This pattern was not unique to the Moon-Eyed People legend. Similar lost white civilization theories were applied to indigenous earthworks and mounds across North America during the same period, generally understood by historians today as a byproduct of 19th century racial ideology rather than genuine archaeological inquiry. Mainstream scholars firmly reject the Welsh origin theory, and many Cherokee historians and cultural authorities have pushed back specifically against this appropriation of their own oral tradition for purposes it was never intended to serve. What remains, once that history is set aside, is a genuinely old Cherokee tradition describing an earlier people, tied to a real and still only partially understood stone structure on a Georgia mountainside. A story whose original meaning, before outside writers began reshaping it for their own purposes, may say less about pale-skinned visitors from across an ocean and more about how the Cherokee themselves understood the deeper, layered history of the land they called home. What then did the earliest Cherokee storytellers actually intend the Moon-Eyed People to represent? And how much of what we think we know about this legend has already been shaped less by the tradition itself than by those who later tried to claim it for a story that was never truly theirs to tell? The question of an earlier, smaller people occupying the land before recorded memory does not belong to the Cherokee alone. Move across nearly the entire continent, from the Pacific Northwest to the Great Lakes, from the plains to the southeast, and you find strikingly similar traditions recurring independently among dozens of distinct native nations, each describing beings often referred to collectively in English as the Little People. These traditions are far from uniform, and that variation matters. Among the Cherokee, the Yunwi-Tsunsti are generally described as small, human-like beings living in rock shelters and forests, capable of both helping and misleading travelers, with a particular reputation for taking lost children, and, in some versions, returning them changed. Among the Iroquois nations, including the Seneca and Mohawk, traditions describe the Joga, sometimes divided into distinct categories associated with specific domains: earth, water, and stone, each with different temperaments and roles within the natural world. Passamaquoddy and other Wabanaki traditions in the Northeast describe Mikumwesu, beings associated with forests and often depicted as skilled hunters. Ojibwe tradition includes the Memegwesi, small beings said to live along rivers and rock formations, sometimes connected to particular pictograph sites still visible today. What makes this pattern worth examining closely is not any single tradition in isolation, but the sheer geographic breadth of the phenomenon. These are not neighboring peoples sharing one another's stories through simple cultural exchange. Many of these nations belong to entirely distinct language families, occupy dramatically different ecological environments, and by most accounts developed largely independently of one another for centuries. and yet the core elements recur with real consistency. Small, human-like beings, generally hidden from ordinary sight, associated closely with specific natural features. Caves, rock formations, forests, riverbanks, and capable of significant influence, for good or ill, over the humans who cross into their territory. Folklorists and anthropologists studying comparative mythology have long grappled with exactly this kind of pattern, not just in North America but worldwide. Small, hidden human-like beings appear across an enormous range of unrelated cultures, from European fairy traditions to numerous societies across Asia and Africa. The most widely accepted academic explanation treats this as a case of convergent cultural development. Separate human societies, largely independently, developing structurally similar traditions to address broadly shared human concerns. The unpredictability of the natural world, the mystery of unexplained disappearances, particularly of children, and the need for a framework explaining sounds, movements, or small physical traces in the landscape that defied more mundane explanation. That comparative framework accounts for a great deal. It does not, on its own, explain certain specific and recurring physical details that some researchers have flagged as worth closer attention. Numerous Little People traditions across otherwise unconnected nations associate these beings with specific, identifiable rock formations, cave systems, or unusual geological features. Sites that, in several documented cases, show genuine evidence of long-term human use, including tool fragments, pictographs, or worked stone, sometimes predating the arrival of the nations who currently maintain the associated tradition. Are these traditions, in cases like these, functioning as a kind of long-term cultural memory, encoding real information about earlier human presence at a specific site, reshaped over generations into the language of small, hidden beings? Anthropologists studying oral tradition elsewhere in the world have documented cases where geological or archaeological realities do appear to have been preserved, in altered form, across many centuries of oral transmission, lending at least plausible support to a similar process having occurred here. Mainstream scholars generally favor exactly this kind of grounded functional explanation, psychological, social, and occasionally historical memory-based, and resist reading these traditions as evidence for any literal, physically distinct population. Many native cultural authorities, for their part, have pushed back against having their traditions reduced to metaphor at all, noting that within their own communities, the Little People are frequently discussed not as symbolic figures, but as genuinely real, spiritually significant beings whose presence continues to be respected and, in some contexts, actively avoided in the present day. A position that sits, deliberately and without contradiction from within the tradition itself, outside the anthropological frameworks used to study it from without. This leaves the documentary lens in a familiar position, able to trace the pattern, the geography, and the possible historical layers beneath it, while remaining unable, and in many cases unwilling, to resolve what these traditions ultimately are: a shared human response to shared uncertainty, a preserved memory of something real, or a living spiritual reality on terms the outside frameworks were never built to fully capture. Why does a story this specific, involving small hidden beings tied to particular stones and caves, recur so consistently across peoples separated by language, geography, and centuries of independent development? And what, if anything, might still be found at the sites where these traditions have quietly persisted the longest? The sound comes first. Wind moves through cedar branches, prairie grass ripples in long waves, and somewhere beyond the next ridge, a solitary figure seems to appear where moments earlier there had been only open land. Across North America, the horizon has always carried possibility. Long before roads connected the continent, rivers, coastlines, forests, and mountain passes linked hundreds of indigenous nations through trade, diplomacy, migration, and shared knowledge. New faces were not uncommon, yet some encounters proved extraordinary enough to survive for centuries in oral tradition. Among those enduring accounts are stories of mysterious visitors, figures remembered for their unusual appearance, unfamiliar knowledge, or uncertain origins. In modern discussions, they are often described collectively as the Pale Visitors. The phrase itself is convenient, though it can also be misleading. There has never been a single indigenous story about one mysterious race of pale strangers. North America has always been home to hundreds of distinct cultures, each preserving its own history, language, and spiritual traditions. The accounts vary enormously. In some communities, unusual visitors are remembered as wise teachers. In others, they arrive as warnings of danger or change. Some belong entirely to the spiritual world, while others seem to describe flesh and blood travelers whose identities faded as generations passed. Even so, the similarities between certain traditions have continued to intrigue historians. One frequently discussed example comes from the Mandan people, whose Earth Lodge villages once lined the Missouri River in what is now North Dakota. When European explorers reached the region during the 18th century, several remarked that some Mandan individuals appeared to have lighter skin, gray or blue eyes, or lighter hair than neighboring nations. Those observations quickly escaped the realm of careful documentation and entered one of history's favorite habits: speculation. By the early 19th century, stories spread suggesting the Mandan were descendants of medieval Welsh explorers, supposedly led by Prince Madoc, a figure whose legendary voyage across the Atlantic has never been supported by credible historical evidence. Others propose lost Norse expeditions or forgotten European colonies that somehow vanished into the interior of North America centuries before Columbus. The theories proved remarkably resilient. Modern archaeology tells a far different story. Excavations of Mandan settlements reveal a continuous indigenous cultural history stretching back through generations. Linguistic studies firmly place the Mandan language within the Siouan language family, while genetic research has found no evidence supporting claims of medieval European ancestry. Today, historians generally regard the old theories as products of 19th century fascination with lost civilizations, rather than conclusions supported by evidence. Yet the larger mystery extends far beyond the Mandan. Throughout North America, scattered oral traditions describe visitors arriving from distant places under unusual circumstances. Some emerge from across the sea. Others descend from mountains or appear unexpectedly on the plains. A few are described using words translated into English as white, pale, shining, bright, or radiant. Translation, however, introduces its own complications. Many indigenous languages use color symbolically rather than literally. A word rendered as white may signify sacredness, dawn, purity, wisdom, peace, or spiritual power depending upon context. Likewise, descriptions of radiant figures may refer to ceremonial significance instead of physical appearance. Modern readers searching for historical clues sometimes interpret these passages literally, while the original storytellers may have intended something entirely different. Anthropologists have spent decades navigating this challenge. Unlike written chronicles, oral traditions often preserve multiple layers of meaning at once. They can record historical events while also expressing moral teachings, spiritual beliefs, environmental knowledge, and cultural identity. The same story may function simultaneously as history, ceremony, and philosophy. Removing one layer can unintentionally change the meaning of the whole. Still, certain accounts continue to raise intriguing questions. Along the Pacific Northwest coast, indigenous nations maintained sophisticated maritime cultures long before European arrival. Massive cedar canoes carried people hundreds of miles along complex trade routes linking distant communities. Encounters with unfamiliar travelers from other coastal societies would have been entirely possible. Could some traditions preserve memories of visitors whose clothing, language, or appearance simply differed from those already known? That explanation satisfies many historians. Others point toward broader possibilities involving transoceanic contact. The first ancestors of indigenous Americans are widely understood to have arrived from Northeast Asia during the last ice age, thousands of years before recorded history. That foundational migration is supported by extensive archaeological, genetic, and linguistic evidence. A separate question remains considerably more uncertain. Did anyone else occasionally reach North America before Columbus? Researchers have examined possible evidence for contact with Polynesian navigators, East Asian sailors, or accidental drifters carried across the Pacific by powerful ocean currents. Polynesian seafaring achievements demonstrate remarkable navigational skill across immense distances, while historical records from later centuries document Japanese fishing vessels drifting across the Pacific after storms. Most proposed examples of pre-Columbian contact remain disputed. Artifacts occasionally cited as proof often lack secure archaeological context, or can be explained through later trade and collection histories. Extraordinary claims require equally extraordinary evidence, and so far no discovery has fundamentally changed the prevailing historical understanding. Yet the question continues to attract attention because the Pacific Ocean has never been an absolute barrier. Then there are traditions that seem to move beyond ordinary travelers altogether. Comparative mythologists have observed that many cultures around the world preserve stories of mysterious figures who arrive unexpectedly, bring important knowledge, establish ceremonies or laws, and eventually depart. Whether found in Asia, Europe, Africa, or the Americas, these narratives often feature strangers whose origins remain uncertain and whose influence far exceeds the brief time they spend among the people they visit. Some scholars see these recurring patterns as expressions of universal human storytelling. Communities naturally remember transformative encounters by elevating them into sacred narratives. Others suggest that at least some stories preserve distant memories of real individuals whose identities gradually became larger than life through generations of retelling. Beyond mainstream scholarship, more speculative ideas have flourished. Writers fascinated by ancient mysteries have proposed forgotten seafaring civilizations capable of crossing oceans long before accepted history allows. Others imagine survivors of lost cultures dispersing across the world after catastrophic events. A smaller group ventures further still, suggesting that unusually described visitors originated somewhere beyond Earth itself. These theories remain firmly outside accepted historical research because no verifiable evidence has confirmed them. Their popularity reflects humanity's enduring attraction to unanswered questions more than it reflects established fact. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of these traditions lies elsewhere. Every culture remembers moments when unfamiliar people appeared unexpectedly. Sometimes they arrived carrying new technologies. Sometimes they introduced unfamiliar beliefs or languages. Sometimes they changed history simply by crossing an unseen boundary between one world and another. Over generations, memory and meaning naturally intertwined until separating historical events from symbolic storytelling became nearly impossible. That complexity has led many indigenous scholars to encourage approaching these traditions on their own terms. Rather than asking only whether every visitor physically existed exactly as described, they suggest asking what the stories were meant to preserve. Relationships, responsibilities, encounters, warnings, and ways of understanding a world where the unknown always remained just beyond the next horizon. Across forests, rivers, coastlines, and open plains, those stories continue to endure. They speak of strangers whose names have faded, whose identities remain uncertain, and whose arrivals left impressions strong enough to survive centuries without written records. Whether they were distant travelers, symbolic teachers, extraordinary individuals transformed by memory, or something history has yet to recognize. One question still lingers like footsteps disappearing into the wind. Who were the first unfamiliar faces that inspired these remarkable stories, and how much of their true identity has been carried away by time? Every story examined so far in this history has come to us filtered, in some way, through outside hands, recorded by a chronicler, reshaped by a later writer, or, in the case we just left, deliberately distorted to serve purposes that had nothing to do with the people who first told it. The Nunnehi offer something closer to an exception, a Cherokee tradition documented with unusual care and detail by ethnographers working directly and respectfully with Cherokee sources, and one the Cherokee themselves have continued to describe on their own terms into the present day. The name Nunnehi is generally translated as the people who live anywhere, or The immortal people. Documented extensively by the ethnographer James Mooney in his 1900 collection of Cherokee myths, compiled from extended fieldwork among Eastern Band Cherokee storytellers in North Carolina, the Nunnehi are described as a spirit people, invisible under ordinary circumstances, living in townhouses beneath specific mountains, rivers, and other prominent geographic features across the traditional Cherokee homeland. Unlike many similarly hidden beings in other regional traditions, the Nunnehi are described consistently as generally benevolent, protective of the Cherokee people specifically, said to have intervened on multiple occasions to warn communities of danger, guide lost travelers home, or even, according to some accounts, assist Cherokee warriors in battle. What distinguishes the Nunnehi tradition further is its specificity. Mooney's fieldwork recorded named locations across the southern Appalachians directly associated with Nunnehi townhouses, particular mountains, particular bends in particular rivers, particular rock formations, treated not as vague or symbolic settings, but as precise, identifiable places within the Cherokee landscape. Some of these locations, including sites in and around what is now the Great Smoky Mountains, remain named and recognized within Cherokee tradition today, occupying the same dual status other sacred sites across this history have shown us: a real, physical location and a spiritual reality understood by many Cherokee people to be genuinely present there, still. The accounts Mooney recorded include specific historical episodes as well, not merely general folklore. One frequently cited account describes Nunnehi assistance during conflicts between Cherokee and Creek communities, with mysterious armed forces said to have appeared and dispersed without explanation, credited by Cherokee tradition to Nunnehi intervention. Whether such accounts reflect genuine unexplained historical incidents reinterpreted through a spiritual framework, coordinated but undocumented military assistance from other Cherokee towns, or purely oral tradition without a specific historical event behind it at all, is not something the existing documentation can resolve with confidence. Mooney recorded the tradition as it was told to him, functioning primarily as a careful transcriber rather than an investigator attempting to verify the underlying historical claims. Mainstream folklorists and anthropologists generally situate the Nunnehi within the same broad comparative category discussed in examining the wider Little People traditions earlier in this history. A spirit being tradition serving important cultural functions, reinforcing the sacredness of specific landscape features, offering a framework for unexplained events, and providing narrative continuity connecting a community to the land it has occupied across many generations. This functional reading is well supported and widely accepted. What it does not fully address is the sheer benevolence and consistency of the Nunnehi tradition specifically, which stands out somewhat against the more ambiguous or actively dangerous character of comparable spirit-being traditions elsewhere. Why does this particular tradition emphasize protection so consistently across so many separately recorded accounts? Some scholars of Cherokee history have suggested a connection to the specific historical trauma the Cherokee endured, including the Trail of Tears in 1838, proposing that a tradition centered on unseen, benevolent protectors may have carried particular emotional and cultural weight for a people who had, in the most literal and devastating sense, been forcibly separated from significant portions of their traditional homeland. This remains an interpretive suggestion, rather than something the historical record can confirm directly, but it is treated seriously within Cherokee historical scholarship. Cherokee cultural authorities today generally maintain, consistent with the pattern already noted in traditions like the Little People, that the Nunnehi are not merely explanatory folklore, but a living spiritual reality. Beings who continue to inhabit the traditional homeland, largely unseen, in a relationship with the land that predates, and has persisted through, everything that has happened to the Cherokee people since. That position exists deliberately outside the anthropological and historical frameworks used to study the tradition from without, and Cherokee sources have generally asked that it be respected on those terms rather than reduced entirely to metaphor or memory. What then are we meant to make of a named mountain, a named river bend, still spoken of today as home to a people few outsiders have ever been permitted to fully understand? and how much of the Cherokee homeland's deeper history might still be held, quietly and protectively, in places the rest of us have simply never learned to look. Follow the Cherokee homeland northwest, past the Appalachian ridgelines, toward the Great Lakes, where a very different kind of hidden being takes shape, not in mountain townhouses, but in the cold, deep water itself. Here, among the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and other Great Lakes nations, tradition speaks of Midewiwin, the underwater panther, one of the most powerful and carefully respected spirit beings in the region's cosmology. Midewiwin is typically described as a creature combining features of a great cat with elements of serpent, deer, and sometimes bird, horned or antlered, scaled along a long tail, said to inhabit the deepest parts of lakes and rivers, particularly dangerous stretches of water known for sudden storms, strong currents, or drownings. Far from a minor folk figure, the underwater panther occupies a central place in Great Lakes cosmology, frequently described as locked in ongoing opposition with thunderbirds, the great sky beings associated with storms, a cosmic balance between the powers of water and sky that many Great Lakes traditions treat as fundamental to the structure of the world itself. What lends this tradition unusual weight, compared to some of the oral-only traditions examined earlier in this history, is its extensive presence in the physical archaeological record. Underwater panther imagery appears carved into rock art sites across the Great Lakes region, including the well-documented pictographs at Agawa Rock on Lake Superior's eastern shore, where a large horned feline figure with a serrated tail remains visible today, painted in red ochre pigment on exposed granite. Similar imagery appears on portable art objects, incised on stone and shell, recovered from archaeological contexts associated with the Mississippian cultural tradition, particularly at sites far to the south, including Cahokia, suggesting the underwater feline motif carried significant meaning across an enormous geographic range and a considerable span of time, likely predating its documentation among the specific nations who maintain the tradition today. This raises a genuine question of cultural transmission and depth. How far back does the underwater panther motif actually extend, and how did a broadly similar figure come to hold significance across cultures separated by such distance, from the Mississippian centers of the Mississippi Valley to Ojibwe and Potawatomi communities around the Great Lakes? Archaeologists generally point to the extensive trade and ceremonial exchange networks known to have connected Mississippian centers with more distant regions, suggesting that potent religious imagery, including figures like the underwater panther, likely spread and was reinterpreted across considerable distances well before European contact, adapted by each receiving culture into its own specific cosmological framework, rather than transmitted as a single fixed tradition. That explanation accounts for the imagery's geographic spread reasonably well. It engages less directly with a more specific and recurring pattern in how the tradition functions on the ground. The remarkably consistent association between underwater panther sites and locations independently known through drowning records, dangerous currents, or unusual underwater topography to be genuinely hazardous. Agawa Rock itself sits above waters known for sudden, dangerous weather changes on Lake Superior. Similar correlations between panther-associated sites and documented drowning hazards have been noted by researchers at other Great Lakes locations as well. Is this simply an intuitive human pattern? Dangerous water naturally attracting a fearsome explanatory tradition? Or does it suggest something closer to accumulated, transmitted ecological knowledge, encoded across generations into cosmological rather than purely practical language, warning communities away from specific hazards long before any of them could be scientifically measured or mapped? Mainstream folklorists tend to favor the more cautious reading, that fear of genuinely dangerous water naturally produces powerful protective traditions, without needing to propose that the traditions themselves encode literal, transmitted hazard data. This is a reasonable and well-supported position, but the correlation, where it has been specifically documented, remains close enough that some researchers studying indigenous ecological knowledge more broadly have suggested it deserves further, more systematic study, rather than dismissal, an area of inquiry that remains, by most accounts, still comparatively underexplored. For the Ojibwe and other Great Lakes nations who maintain the tradition today, Mishibiju continues to be treated with the same seriousness afforded any significant spiritual power. A being still respected, still spoken of carefully, still associated with specific waters where caution is understood to be warranted for reasons that are, in the tradition's own terms, considerably more than metaphorical. What then is actually being preserved in the carved red ochre outline still visible on the stone at Agawa Rock? A memory of danger encoded across unknown centuries, a living spiritual power still active in those waters today, or some understanding of the relationship between the two that the outside frameworks brought to this mystery have simply never been equipped to fully separate. The tension between sky and water we just traced through the underwater panther and its thunderbird rival finds a close cousin far to the south, back in the Cherokee homeland already explored earlier in this history. A tradition centered not on a lake-dwelling feline, but on a massive horned serpent said to inhabit deep pools, mountain passes, and dark, isolated waters across the southern Appalachians, the Uktena. Documented extensively by James Mooney during the same fieldwork that recorded the Nunnehi tradition, the Uktena is described in Cherokee tradition as an enormous serpent, as thick as a tree trunk, with a single crystalline horn on its forehead called the unanswered, said to glow and burn with intense light. Encircling its body, according to the tradition, are rings or spots said to blaze with a fire so dangerous that a person could not even look directly at the creature without risking death, blindness, or madness. Mooney recorded specific Cherokee accounts describing the Uktena as extraordinarily difficult to kill and dangerous even in death. The crystal at its forehead retained as a source of immense supernatural power, but only for those who understood the precise, carefully guarded ritual knowledge required to obtain and safely handle it. What distinguishes the Uktena tradition, much like the Nunnehi before it, is the specificity and consistency with which it was recorded directly from Cherokee sources, alongside named locations across the Appalachian landscape long associated with the serpent's presence. Deep pools, mountain gaps, and river bends treated within the tradition as genuinely dangerous places to be approached with appropriate caution and respect. This is not vague or free-floating folklore. It is tied to real, specific geography, much of it still recognized within Cherokee tradition today. The horned or antlered serpent motif itself, however, extends well beyond Cherokee tradition alone, appearing under different names across a remarkably wide range of indigenous nations throughout eastern North America. Variations recorded among the Iroquois, the Shawnee, and numerous other peoples, generally sharing the core elements of a great serpent, often horned, frequently associated with deep water, danger, and significant supernatural power. As with the underwater panther tradition just examined, this raises a comparable question about the depth and breadth of the imagery's history. Horned serpent motifs appear in the archaeological record well before European contact, carved into shell gorgets and engraved on stone across Mississippian-era sites throughout the southeastern United States, suggesting, much like the underwater panther, a motif with genuinely ancient roots and wide-reaching significance across the deeper indigenous history of the continent, likely predating its specific Cherokee expression by a considerable span of time. Mainstream folklorists and archaeologists generally read the Uktena and horned serpent traditions more broadly within a similar comparative framework already applied to other water-associated spirit beings across this history. Powerful, cautionary traditions marking genuinely hazardous locations, reflecting deep, likely pre-contact roots, and carrying spiritual significance considerably beyond simple folklore or explanatory myth. This reading is well supported by the archaeological continuity of the imagery itself, tracing back across many centuries of continuous use and reinterpretation. What resists easy explanation is the remarkably specific and consistent detail concerning the unanswered crystal at the center of the tradition, a detail treated by Mooney's Cherokee sources not as incidental decoration, but as the actual narrative and ritual focus of the entire story, described with a level of procedural and ritual specificity. How it must be obtained, handled, and used. that is unusual even by the standards of comparable traditions elsewhere. Some historians of Cherokee religious practice have noted that crystal and mineral objects did hold genuine, well-documented ritual and divinatory significance within actual historical Cherokee spiritual practice, a use attested independently of the Uktena narrative itself. Whether the Uktena story developed specifically to explain and reinforce the significance of an already existing ritual practice, or whether the ritual practice developed from the narrative, or whether the two are better understood as having grown together over an extended and effectively untraceable span of time, is not something the existing historical and ethnographic record can resolve with any confidence. For the Cherokee, much like the traditions already examined in this history, the Uktena is generally treated as considerably more than an explanatory folk tale. A genuinely respected, carefully approached spiritual power, tied to real places across the traditional homeland, deserving the same seriousness any other significant element of Cherokee religious life would receive. What then was actually encountered, by whom, and how long ago, at the specific deep pools and mountain passes still named in connection with the Uktena today? And how much of the ritual knowledge once carefully guarded around it has already been lost to the same centuries of disruption that scattered so much else this history has traced. The ritual knowledge once guarded around the Ulansuti crystal was, by Cherokee tradition itself, only ever meant to survive through careful transmission from teacher to student, a fragile kind of preservation, dependent entirely on the chain never breaking. That same fragility, and the same question of what a community chooses, or is forced to remember across generations, sits at the center of a tradition found not among one nation alone, but across an extraordinary range of indigenous peoples throughout North America. A story of a great flood. Flood narratives appear, independently recorded, among a remarkable number of native nations spanning the continent. The Anishinaabe describe a great flood following a period of world corruption, with the earth eventually remade by Nanabojo, who directs animals to dive for a small amount of soil from beneath the floodwaters, ultimately used to recreate dry land. The Hopi describe emergence traditions involving successive worlds, one of which is destroyed by flood before the people ascend into the current world. Numerous Pacific Northwest nations, including Coast Salish communities, maintain detailed flood traditions, some associated with specific mountains said to have provided refuge for survivors. Similar core elements, catastrophic flooding, survival on a mountain or through divine intervention, and a subsequent remaking or repopulating of the world, appear among the Choctaw, the Caddo, numerous California nations, and many others, recorded independently by ethnographers working across the continent from the 19th century onward. This breadth invites an obvious and difficult question. Flood narratives are not unique to North America. They appear across an enormous range of human cultures worldwide, from Mesopotamian and biblical accounts to traditions recorded in South America, Australia, and Asia. Comparative mythologists have long debated why this particular narrative structure recurs with such consistency across societies with no plausible direct contact. The most widely accepted explanation treats it as a natural product of shared human experience. Flooding is among the most universally destructive and memorable natural disasters a community can face, and a narrative addressing large-scale catastrophic loss, survival, and world renewal serves comparable psychological and cultural functions regardless of where or when a particular society develops it. That explanation accounts for a great deal, but it engages less directly with a specific pattern some researchers have highlighted concerning indigenous North American flood traditions in particular. In several documented cases, oral traditions describing catastrophic flooding correspond to identifiable specific geographic features, name mountains understood within a given tradition as refuge sites. And modern geological research has, in a genuinely notable handful of instances, independently confirmed evidence of significant regional flooding events in the deeper past near some of these locations, including major glacial lake outburst floods known to have occurred across parts of North America at the end of the last ice age, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 BC. Do any specific indigenous flood traditions preserve genuine transmitted memory of these documented ancient events, carried forward across an almost unimaginable span of purely oral transmission? Or does the correlation, where researchers have identified it, reflect something closer to coincidence, or a natural tendency for flood narratives to attach themselves, over time, and independent of any specific original event, to locally prominent and appropriately dramatic geographic features? This question sits at a genuinely contested edge of current scholarship, distinct from the outright pseudo-history examined earlier in this history, such as the Madoc legend. A small number of serious geologists and anthropologists, working collaboratively and respectfully with specific indigenous communities, have pursued targeted research into potential correlations between local oral tradition and known deep history geological events, treating the traditions as a genuinely possible, if difficult to verify, source of transmitted environmental memory rather than pure metaphor. This research remains limited in scope, methodologically challenging, and far from a scholarly consensus. But it is approached, notably, with considerably more caution and respect for the traditions themselves than the outside distortions examined in earlier chapters of this history. Many indigenous nations, for their part, maintain their flood traditions as exactly what they have always been understood to be within the culture: significant sacred narratives explaining the current shape of the world and the relationship between a people and the land they inhabit, valuable and true on their own terms, regardless of whether outside science ever manages to correlate them with a specific verifiable event. What remains, across every version of this story recorded from Puget Sound to the Gulf Coast, is a shared human question posed independently by dozens of separate peoples across an entire continent. What does a community choose to remember, and how, when the world itself seems briefly to have ended and then, against all expectation, begun again? Return now to the forests of the Northeast, where the Iroquois nations, the Seneca, Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Oneida, together forming the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, maintain one of the most physically distinctive spirit-being traditions recorded anywhere on the continent. A race of giant cannibalistic beings whose skin was said to be covered entirely in stone. Known among the Seneca as the Jananskwa and referred to more broadly in English as the Stone Coats, these beings are described across Haudenosaunee oral tradition as immense in size, immensely strong, and nearly invulnerable to ordinary weapons because of the rock-like covering encasing their bodies. Vulnerable, according to most accounts, only at the soles of their feet. Traditions describe them as predatory, hunting and consuming human beings, particularly said to be drawn toward communities weakened by isolation or crisis. Some versions of the tradition describe the Stonecoats as having once been ordinary humans, transformed through specific circumstances, exposure to certain winter conditions or deliberate ritual transgression, into their monstrous stone-covered state, blurring the line between an entirely separate species and a warning about what human beings themselves might become under the wrong conditions. The tradition was documented extensively by ethnographers working with Haudenosaunee communities from the 19th century onward, including detailed accounts recorded by Iroquoian scholars working directly with tradition keepers. And it remains a significant and actively maintained element of Haudenosaunee oral culture today, distinct from the more diffuse or fragmentary traditions that outside chroniclers sometimes only partially captured elsewhere. What gives the Stonecoat tradition a distinctive character compared to some of the other beings examined across this history is the specific narrative role it plays within the wider Haudenosaunee storytelling tradition. Stonecoats are frequently defeated not through brute force, which their invulnerable exterior generally renders futile, but through cleverness, trickery, or the intervention of culture hero figures who understand the specific, narrow vulnerability the Stonecoats possess. This narrative structure, a seemingly unstoppable threat defeated through precise, specialized knowledge rather than raw strength, recurs across numerous individual stories within the broader tradition, suggesting a consistent underlying moral and cultural framework rather than a loosely connected collection of independent tales. Why does a tradition organized around stone-covered cannibalistic giants take the particular shape it has? And what, if anything, might it preserve beyond its immediate narrative and cautionary function? Mainstream folklorists generally situate the Stonecoats within a broader, well-documented category of giant and monster traditions found across numerous human cultures worldwide, frequently serving to encode genuine environmental or survival warnings. The specific danger of severe winter conditions, isolation, and, in some historical interpretations, the memory of genuine periods of starvation-driven desperation, reshaped over generations into external, monstrous form rather than preserved as direct historical memory of human hardship. This reading fits reasonably well with the specific detail present in some versions of the tradition, connecting stonecoats to winter and to communities under survival stress. There is also a narrower, more specific thread some researchers have noted. Reports recorded independently across multiple Haudenosaunee communities and also, in broadly similar form, among some neighboring Algonquian-speaking peoples, describing occasional physical traces connected to the tradition, unusual stone formations, or in a smaller number of documented oral accounts, alleged discoveries of unusually large skeletal remains, interpreted within the tradition as physical evidence of the stone coat's historical reality. Mainstream archaeologists and anthropologists generally attribute such claims to a combination of misidentified animal remains, natural geological formations subject to culturally informed interpretation, and the ordinary embellishment that accompanies oral tradition transmitted across many generations. A cautious, well-supported position, though one that has not been definitively verified against every individual claim recorded across the tradition's considerable geographic range. For the Haudenosaunee, much like the other living traditions traced across this history, the stone coats occupy a position considerably more serious than simple monster folklore. They are treated as part of a broader, coherent spiritual framework addressing danger, transformation, and the boundary between human and something no longer fully human. A framework many Haudenosaunee people continue to regard as carrying genuine cultural and spiritual weight, deserving the same seriousness afforded any other significant element of Haudenosaunee tradition, rather than reduction to campfire storytelling for outside audiences. What then were the earliest tellers of the stone coat tradition actually describing when they spoke of skin turned to stone and a hunger that could not be reasoned with? A specific, remembered danger reshaped into monstrous form across generations of telling, or a warning whose deeper meaning, like so much else across this history, was never fully meant to leave the communities who have always known how to survive it. The stone coat's vulnerability at the sole of the foot, and the trickery required to defeat them, belongs to a broader Cherokee and Iroquoian storytelling tradition, in which cleverness, not strength, decides who survives an encounter with something far larger than a person. Among the Cherokee themselves, that same tension, overwhelming physical power versus the fragile, careful negotiations of ordinary people, takes shape in the story of Tsul, the Slant-Eyed giant, also known by the name Djodi'kwado. Documented by James Mooney in the same 19th century fieldwork that recorded the Nunnehi and the Uktena, the Tsul tradition describes an enormous being with distinctive sloping or slanting eyes, said to dwell at Tsunagunyi, on the slopes of Tennessee Bald in what is now western North Carolina. In the best-known version of the story, recorded by Mooney directly from Cherokee tradition keepers, a widow instructs her daughter to marry only a skilled hunter. A mysterious, highly successful hunter begins courting the girl, arriving always after dark and leaving before dawn, until the girl's mother finally glimpses him fully. A giant so large his head presses against the rafters and his feet scrape the roof on the opposite side of the room. Discovered and named in her fear, the giant departs in sorrow and anger, retreating permanently from human sight, and is never again seen directly by the Cherokee people from that point forward. Beyond the narrative itself, Tsul holds a specific and enduring role in Cherokee spiritual life as the great lord of the game, a master of animals figure invoked in hunting rites, understood as governing the availability and behavior of game animals across the landscape. Mooney recorded that in its plural form, the term also referred to a broader tradition of a slant-eyed giant people said to have visited the Cherokee from the far west in earlier times, a detail that, intriguingly, was later used by Cherokee translators rendering the Book of Genesis into the Cherokee language, who chose this same word to translate the giants, or Nephilim, described in Genesis 6:4, according to scholars who have studied the translation. What lends the tradition unusual physical weight is Djodi'kwado rock, a large soapstone boulder in Jackson County, North Carolina, covered in an extensive field of petroglyphs, human-like figures, animal tracks, and abstract symbols carved into the stone's surface. Local and Cherokee tradition has long associated this specific rock directly with Tsul Kalu, and the site remains actively studied by archaeologists today. The petroglyphs themselves have never been definitively dated or fully deciphered, and their exact age, purpose, and full symbolic meaning remain genuinely open questions within the archaeological record. A rare case where a documented oral tradition points directly to a physical, still existing artifact whose own mystery has never been fully resolved on its own separate terms. Mainstream folklorists generally read Tsul Kalu within the broader Master of Animals tradition found across numerous hunting societies worldwide, a spirit figure governing the ethical and practical relationship between hunters and the game they depend on, reinforcing specific behavioral norms around respectful, sustainable hunting practice. This functional reading fits comfortably with the story's core narrative concerns and its continued invocation in hunting ritual. It engages less directly with Djodi'kwado rock itself, whose carvings predate, by most archaeological estimates, the specific recorded version of the story Mooney collected, raising the now familiar question already encountered elsewhere in this history. Did the carvings inspire or accumulate around an existing oral tradition, or did the tradition develop, at least in part, as a way of explaining markings whose original purpose had already been lost to memory by the time the story took its currently recorded form? Some outside observers, working well outside Cherokee tradition itself, have proposed connections between Tsul Kalu and broader Sasquatch or wildman traditions found across other cultures. A comparison Cherokee scholars generally treat with considerable caution, noting that collapsing a specific spiritually significant figure into a generic cryptid framework tends to strip away the tradition's actual cultural and ceremonial meaning. What then is actually carved into the surface of Djodi'kwado rock, a record connected directly to the giant hunting spirit the Cherokee still invoke today, or a separate, older mystery that simply happened to settle, over centuries of retelling, beneath the shadow of a story large enough to hold it? The carvings at Djodi'kwado rock, still undeciphered despite generations of study, are not the only fragment of Haudenosaunee and Iroquoian tradition to survive without a clear resolution attached to it. Among the Seneca and other Haudenosaunee nations, a different kind of solitary, unexplained figure recurs across oral tradition. Not a giant with a body too large for an ordinary home, but a being that appears to have no body at all beyond an enormous, disembodied head. Known among the Seneca as the Flying Head, or in some recorded accounts as Dagwanoenyent, this figure is described as an immense human head, without a body, propelled through the air by long, wild hair, or in some versions by wings, with prominent teeth or fangs, and an insatiable hunger. Traditions describe the Flying Head as a genuinely fearsome antagonist, sometimes associated with storms and high winds, said to hunt at night and to be repelled or defeated through cleverness rather than force. In several recorded versions, tricked into eating something it cannot properly digest, such as hot coals or roasting nuts, which ultimately destroys or drives it away. Documented by ethnographers working with Haudenosaunee communities from the 19th century onward, the Flying Head appears across a range of individual stories rather than a single fixed narrative, suggesting a broadly shared cultural figure adapted and retold by different storytellers and communities over an extended period. In several versions, the Flying Head is associated with a specific origin, a woman transformed through grief, isolation, or witchcraft into her monstrous state, echoing a pattern already noted elsewhere in this history, where a boundary-crossing monster is understood not as an entirely separate species, but as a warning about what human beings themselves might become under sufficiently extreme circumstances. What distinguishes the Flying Head from many of the other beings traced across this history is the specific, recurring narrative logic built into its defeat. Nearly every recorded version hinges on the same structural detail. The Flying Head's destruction comes not through confrontation or weaponry, but through deception involving food, and specifically through the being's own uncontrolled hunger being turned against it. This is a distinct pattern from the narrow physical vulnerability seen in the stone coat's unprotected feet, or the specialized ritual knowledge required to safely approach the Uktena's crystal. Here, the vulnerability is psychological and appetitive rather than physical, suggesting, to some folklorists who have studied the tradition comparatively, that the flying head may function specifically as a moral lesson about the dangers of unchecked consumption or desire, rather than as a purely external threat to be defended against by force. Mainstream folklorists generally situate the flying head within a broader, well-documented category of monstrous or cannibal spirit traditions found across numerous northeastern woodlands cultures. Some scholars noting loose thematic parallels with other regional traditions describing similarly monstrous, consumption-driven beings. Though the flying head's specific disembodied airborne form appears to be a distinctive Haudenosaunee elaboration, rather than a widely shared regional template. This reading treats the tradition as serving genuine and identifiable cultural functions, reinforcing communal values around moderation and self-control, offering children and adults alike a vivid cautionary framework, and providing an explanatory outlet for unsettling natural phenomena, particularly sudden high winds and storms, with which the flying head is frequently associated in the recorded accounts. There remains, within this otherwise well-explained tradition, a narrower and more specific question that has drawn less scholarly attention than it might deserve. Why does this particular being, among the wide range of monstrous figures documented across Haudenosaunee tradition, take the specific form of a head with no body at all, rather than the more common giant serpent or transformed animal structures found elsewhere in comparable traditions? Some researchers studying indigenous storytelling structures more broadly have suggested that fully disembodied threat figures are comparatively rare across world folklore generally, which may indicate either a genuinely distinctive piece of Haudenosaunee symbolic imagination, or the survival of an older narrative element whose original context and meaning have not been fully preserved in the versions that reached outside ethnographers. This remains speculative, and the existing documentation does not allow it to be resolved with any confidence. For Haudenosaunee communities today, the flying head, much like the other traditions traced across this history, continues to be understood as considerably more than a simple children's cautionary tale, a recognized and respected part of a broader spiritual and moral framework, carrying weight that outside classification as folklore or monster legend does not fully capture on its own terms. What then first gave shape to a threat with no body, only appetite and motion? And how much of what made the earliest tellers of this story afraid has survived intact, or been quietly reshaped in every retelling since? The question of what a tradition preserves across generations of retelling, raised by the flying head's uncertain, possibly older origins, takes on a different weight entirely when the tradition in question is not a monster story, but a formal, structured body of prophecy, understood by the people who carry it as literal guidance for the fate of an entire nation across centuries. Among the Anishinaabe, the people encompassing the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations of the Great Lakes region, this tradition is known as the Prophecy of the Seven Fires. According to Anishinaabe oral tradition, 7 prophets appeared to the people at a time when they were living along the northeastern Atlantic coast of North America, each delivering a message describing a coming era, or fire, in the life of the nation. The earliest fires, according to the tradition, foretold a great westward migration, instructing the people to follow the sign of a sacred mega-shell inland along a great river connecting 2 large freshwater seas, stopping at a series of designated locations along the way, until they reached a place where food grows upon the water. Anishinaabe oral history and later ethnographic and historical research broadly agree that this describes a genuine, centuries-long westward migration from the Atlantic coast toward the Great Lakes, culminating in the discovery of wild rice, or manumin, in the lake systems of present-day Minnesota and Wisconsin, a migration substantially corroborated by linguistic, archaeological, and birch bark scroll evidence maintained within the Midewiwin, the Anishinaabe Medicine Society responsible for preserving much of this tradition. What makes the Seven Fires prophecy a genuinely distinct case among the traditions traced across this history is what comes next. The fourth prophecy, according to the tradition, foretold the arrival of a light-skinned race, describing two possible paths that encounter could take. One bringing knowledge and welcome exchange, the other bringing destruction, suffering, and the tearing apart of families and communities. Later prophecies, generally understood as the fifth and sixth fires, are frequently interpreted by Anishinaabe elders and scholars as describing a period of significant spiritual and cultural disruption, a time when younger generations would turn away from traditional teachings, families would be fractured, and the nation's ceremonial life would come under sustained pressure. Many contemporary tradition keepers have connected this specific portion of the prophecy directly to the historical era of forced assimilation, including the residential and boarding school system that separated Indigenous children from their families and communities across the 19th and 20th centuries. The tradition was first documented in its full, formal written structure by Edward Benton Benai, an Anishinaabe elder and educator, in his 1988 work, The Mishomi's Book. Though Benton Benai and other tradition keepers have consistently emphasized that the prophecy itself long predates this written record, having been carried orally and preserved in part through Midewiwin birchbark scrolls across many generations before being set down in English for wider circulation. This raises a question familiar from elsewhere in this history. How much of the specific language and emphasis found in the widely circulated modern version reflects an unbroken, precisely preserved oral chain, and how much may reflect later interpretation, shaped inevitably by the storyteller's own historical vantage point, writing after the event some readers understand the prophecy to have described. Mainstream historians and religious studies scholars generally approach this question with considerable care, distinguishing between the well-supported historical migration described in the earlier fires, corroborated by archaeological and linguistic evidence independent of the prophecy itself, and the more difficult-to-verify predictive claims of the later fires, which by their nature resist the kind of external confirmation available for a documented migration route. Scholars studying oral prophecy traditions more broadly note that such traditions often gain particular emphasis and clarity in later retellings, specifically because they resonate so directly with events the community has already lived through. A pattern that does not necessarily indicate fabrication, but does complicate any simple claim of the prophecy having been fixed in its precise modern wording prior to the events it is often read as describing. For the Anishinaabe today, the prophecy carries significant weight beyond this historical question, particularly its unresolved seventh fire, understood by many contemporary tradition keepers as describing the present era, a time in which a new people would arise to search for lost teachings, offering the possibility of a genuine cultural and spiritual reawakening contingent on choices not yet fully made. What then does it mean for a people to carry a prophecy this specific across centuries of disruption, loss, and forced separation from the very teachings the prophecy itself warned they might lose? And how much of its meaning is still, by the tradition's own account, waiting to be decided? Travel southwest now, away from the Great Lakes and its prophecies of migration and light-skinned encounter, into the high desert mesas of what is now New Mexico, where the Zuni people maintain one of the most vividly documented cannibal giant traditions recorded anywhere in North America, centered on a cave still known, in Zuni tradition, by the name of the creature said to have lived there, Atahsaia. The tradition was recorded in unusual depth by the anthropologist Frank Hamilton Cushing, who lived among the Zuni from 1879 to 1884, learning the language and being formally adopted into Zuni society. An immersive, extended fieldwork arrangement rare for its era, and one that lent his subsequent 1901 collection, Zuni Folk Tales, a level of narrative detail and internal consistency not always found in more distant ethnographic accounts. Cushing's recordings describe Atahsaia as a demon of genuinely striking physical specificity. A body as large as a big elk's, a chest bristling with hair as stiff as porcupine quills, arms and legs covered in mottled black and white scales, bulging eyes that never blink, and a wide mouth suited to a diet explicitly and repeatedly described as human flesh, with particular emphasis on children. The best-known narrative, Atahsaia, the cannibal demon, describes the creature disguising himself as an elderly, harmless relative to deceive two young women, luring them toward his cave with the intention of feeding them a broth made from human children before consuming them himself. The women are ultimately rescued by the Zuni twin war gods, Ahayuta and Matsailema, who defeat Atahsaia, skin him, and construct an effigy from his hide. A detail Cushing recorded with particular narrative care, and one that recurs across multiple individual tales rather than existing as an isolated episode. What gives the Atahsaia tradition unusual physical grounding, compared to many of the beings traced elsewhere in this history, is the specific, named cave associated with him. A real identifiable rock formation above what Cushing's recorded telling calls the Town of the Cliffs, still referred to in Zuni tradition as the Cave of Atahsaia. As with Djodi'kwado rock in Cherokee tradition, this represents a case where oral narrative and physical geography are directly and explicitly linked, rather than existing as separate, loosely associated elements. Mainstream folklorists generally situate Atahsaia within the broad, well-documented category of cannibal ogre traditions found across numerous indigenous nations of the Southwest and beyond, understanding such figures as serving clear cultural functions, reinforcing warnings against trusting strangers, particularly those claiming false kinship, and providing a vivid framework addressing the genuine historical reality of famine, isolation, and, in periods of severe hardship, the very real fear of starvation-driven desperation. Themes echoed, as previously noted in this history, in traditions like the Haudenosaunee stone coats. This reading fits the recorded narrative details well, particularly the tradition's consistent emphasis on deception through false family resemblance as the mechanism of danger. There is also a narrower historical question some researchers have raised concerning the tradition's possible roots in genuine, pre-contact conflict. Archaeological evidence from the broader Southwest, including documented instances of violence between competing groups in the region prior to European contact, has led some to propose that traditions like Atahsaia may preserve a distorted cultural memory of specific historical raiders or outcasts, individuals exiled from their communities for serious transgressions, whose genuinely fearsome reputation may have been gradually reshaped across generations of retelling into the fully monstrous, physically exaggerated form Cushing eventually recorded. This remains a speculative interpretation rather than a position with strong archaeological confirmation specific to the Atahsaia tradition itself, and most folklorists remain cautious about drawing too direct a line between any specific historical conflict and a fully developed oral tradition recorded many generations later. For the Zuni, the tradition continues to carry the same weight already noted across comparable living traditions in this history, treated as a meaningful part of a broader religious and cultural framework involving the twin war gods and their protective role, rather than simple cautionary folklore detached from deeper spiritual significance. What, then, first gave Atahsaia his specific, carefully remembered shape? Porcupine bristled chest, mottled scaled arms, a cave still named for him on a New Mexico mesa. And how much of whatever genuinely frightened the earliest Zuni storytellers still waits, unresolved, in the empty stone chamber that bears his name. 2 centuries after Cushing first sat with Zuni storytellers to record their oldest fears, several hundred miles to the northeast, a different kind of mystery had already unfolded. Not preserved in oral tradition passed carefully down through generations, but scattered across colonial records, archaeological survey, and one particularly disturbing act of violence that historians still work to fully reconstruct. It concerns the Susquehannock, an Iroquoian-speaking nation who, at the time of European contact, controlled the river valley that still bears their name. When Englishman John Smith first encountered a group of Susquehannock warriors near the mouth of the Susquehanna River in 1608, he described them, based on accounts relayed to him by the Powhatan Confederacy, as formidable and physically imposing. Archaeological evidence suggests the Susquehannock had occupied the region for roughly 1,000 years by that point, having likely migrated eastward from the Ohio Valley in earlier centuries. and by the early 17th century, they stood among the most populous and powerful indigenous nations in the mid-Atlantic region, with population estimates for 1600 ranging between 5,000 and 7,000 people, organized across several distinct communities. Through the mid-17th century, the Susquehannock built a position of genuine regional power, serving as key intermediaries in the fur trade between European colonies and indigenous nations further inland, while defending their territory successfully against repeated incursions from the Western Iroquois Confederacy, including a notable victory around 666 against combined Seneca and Cayuga forces. Their alliance with the English colony of Maryland, formalized through the 1652 Articles of Peace and Friendship, initially reinforced their position, even as it required ceding significant territory along the Chesapeake. Then, within roughly a single decade, this considerable regional power collapsed with startling speed. The early 1670s brought a rapid, severe population decline, generally attributed by historians to a combination of smallpox and other epidemic disease introduced through European contact, alongside intensifying warfare tied to the broader colonial-era conflicts known as the Beaver Wars. By 1675, the weakened Susquehannock suffered decisive defeat at the hands of the Iroquois Confederacy. Survivors scattered in multiple directions, some fleeing west through Allegheny Mountain passes into Ohio, where they are believed to have been absorbed into Shawnee communities. Others relocating northward into New York, where they were incorporated into Seneca and Onondaga communities, following the Haudenosaunee established practice of adopting defeated peoples rather than simply displacing them. Still others remaining in the Susquehanna Valley itself, eventually resettling by the 1690s, in a village the English came to call Conestoga. This dispersal raises the first genuinely unresolved question historians continue to grapple with: precisely how much of the Susquehannock nation was absorbed, intact, into these various host communities, carrying forward specific elements of language, governance, and identity, versus how much was lost entirely in the process. Individuals surviving, but the coherent structure of the nation itself effectively dissolving. Colonial-era record-keeping regarding indigenous populations was inconsistent and frequently indifferent at best, and modern historians working from the surviving documentary and archaeological record, including Barry Kent's extensive archaeological study of the Susquehanna Valley's indigenous peoples, generally acknowledge that a fully precise accounting of where every dispersed group ultimately settled and how thoroughly their distinct identity persisted within host nations remains genuinely incomplete. By 1700, the remaining Susquehannock population at Conestoga numbered only around 300 people, a catastrophic decline from the thousands recorded a century earlier. And the community's story did not end quietly. In December 1763, a vigilante group of Pennsylvania colonists known as the Paxton Boys, acting amid regional tensions during Pontiac's War, attacked and murdered the remaining Susquehannock residents of Conestoga, including individuals under the direct protection of colonial authorities. An atrocity that effectively ended the last continuously identifiable Susquehannock community in the Susquehanna Valley itself. What survives beyond this documented endpoint is more fragmentary. Some historians have traced likely Susquehannock descent among later prominent indigenous figures, including the Oneida leader Shenandoah and the Mingo leader Logan, both active generations after Conestoga's destruction, suggesting genuine, if diffuse, lines of descent persisting within other nations. But the broader question: how much of Susquehannock language, specific ceremonial practice, and distinct cultural identity survived this absorption in any recognizable form, versus how much was permanently lost in the process of dispersal, disease, and violence, remains an active and only partially answered subject of ongoing historical and archaeological research. What then actually became of the Susquehannock nation in the decades following their scattering? A people fully absorbed and quietly continuing within the communities that took them in, or one whose distinct voice was allowed to fade into silence long before anyone thought to ask what, exactly, had been lost? Miles east of the lands explored in the previous mystery, the camera moves toward the forested valleys and waterways of the Haudenosaunee homeland, where morning mist settles over ancient trails, and the stones beneath the trees seem to hold memories of another age. Among these landscapes, passed down through generations of oral tradition, are stories of the Djodi'kwado, the stone giants said to have once walked across the land. The name itself carries the weight of something ancient. In Haudenosaunee traditions, the Djodi'kwado are described as powerful beings associated with stone, strength, and the deep wilderness. Accounts of these figures come through indigenous oral histories, where stories preserve teachings about the relationship between humans, the natural world, and forces that exist beyond ordinary experience. These traditions were never simply tales of monsters hiding in the woods. They were part of a broader understanding of the landscape, where rivers, mountains, animals, and stones could all carry meaning. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, formed a powerful alliance of indigenous nations in northeastern North America, including the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and later, the Tuscarora. For centuries, Haudenosaunee communities maintained extensive oral traditions that recorded history, law, spirituality, and lessons about the world around them. Within these traditions, stories of unusual beings offered explanations for mysterious places and reminders about the dangers of arrogance, violence, and disrespect toward the natural order. The Djodi'kwado occupy a fascinating space between history, memory, and mystery. They are often described as giants made of or connected to stone, creatures whose size and strength place them outside the boundaries of ordinary human life. Some stories portray them as dangerous beings encountered by ancestors traveling through unfamiliar lands. Others connect them to ancient times when the world was filled with powerful beings who shaped the conditions of human existence. Across North America, giant figures appear in many indigenous traditions. These stories vary widely between cultures, reflecting different histories and teachings. The existence of these traditions raises a question that has intrigued researchers for generations. Why do so many societies preserve memories of beings larger than life? One explanation is that giants represent symbolic forces rather than physical creatures. In this interpretation, the Djodi'kwado embody challenges faced by humanity: strength without wisdom, power without balance, or the untamed forces of the natural world. Similar themes appear throughout global mythology, where enormous beings often represent the unknown spaces beyond human control. Yet the mystery deepens when these traditions are considered alongside the physical landscape itself. The northeastern woodlands contain countless unusual rock formations, towering cliffs, and massive stones shaped by glaciers thousands of years ago. To people living among these features, such formations could inspire stories of beings connected to the earth itself. A solitary boulder in a forest clearing, a weathered stone figure, or a cliff rising above a river could become part of a living story passed from one generation to the next. European observers who encountered indigenous traditions often recorded stories through their own cultural perspectives. Some early accounts attempted to compare unfamiliar beings with creatures from European folklore, creating interpretations that sometimes changed the original meaning. Modern researchers approach these traditions with greater attention to indigenous voices, recognizing oral histories as complex records shaped by language, place, and cultural knowledge. The question surrounding the Djodi'kwado also enters the world of speculation. Some enthusiasts have suggested that stories of stone giants may preserve memories of encounters with ancient peoples, unknown creatures, or misunderstood archaeological discoveries. These ideas remain outside mainstream archaeology, which has found no evidence confirming the existence of literal stone giants. Still, the persistence of the stories continues to capture curiosity. Could the Djodi'kwado represent distant memories transformed through centuries of storytelling? Could they reflect encounters with unusual landscapes that became woven into human imagination? Or are they something more symbolic, a way for generations to describe forces that are larger than themselves? The challenge in exploring traditions like these is understanding them on their own terms. Oral histories are not fossils waiting to be uncovered in the ground. They are living traditions, carrying knowledge through voices, ceremonies, and stories. Their value comes from what they reveal about how people understood their world and their place within it. Deep in the forests and valleys of Haudenosaunee territory, the stones remain silent. They mark paths, borders, and places remembered by generations. Whether the Djodi'kwado were once understood as literal beings, spiritual figures, or powerful symbols, their presence in tradition continues to raise questions about the mysteries hidden within landscapes that humans have traveled for thousands of years. And as the old stories continue to be told, one question remains beneath the shadow of the forests and the weight of the stones. What memories of the ancient world are still waiting to be uncovered? Centuries before any European set foot along the Mississippi, the story had already begun. Long before Marquette's canoe ever slid past the limestone bluffs near what is now Alton, Illinois, the people who lived along that river were already telling a different kind of story. One carried not in ink, but in memory, passed from voice to voice across generations. By the time that story reached paper, it had already traveled a long way. The bluff itself rises sharply from the riverbank, its face scarred by centuries of wind and current. It was here, or somewhere very near here, that early travelers reported something extraordinary. A painted image, enormous and strange, watching over the water from high above the river. They called it the Piasa bird. The name likely descends from the Illinois language, though its precise translation remains a matter of scholarly disagreement. What is not disputed is the description passed down through written and oral record alike. A creature with the body of a bird, the face of a man, antlers or horns crowning its head, claws capable of seizing prey, and a tail so long it seemed to wrap the entire figure in on itself. It was not rendered as any animal a hunter might recognize. It was something else, assembled, deliberate, unsettling. The first European account of the image comes from Jacques Marquette, the French missionary who, alongside Louis Joliet, traveled the Mississippi in 1673. Marquette's journals describe painted figures on the cliffs unlike anything in his prior experience, vivid enough that he took the trouble to record them for readers who would never see the river themselves. Through his writing, the Piasa entered the historical record, and then, gradually, it disappeared from the rock itself. Erosion wore at the limestone for generations. Later, quarrying operations removed sections of the bluff altogether, taking with them whatever remained of the original painting. What survives today is not the image, but the description of it, layered through Marquette's account, through the sketches and reconstructions that followed, and through the oral traditions of the Illinois people who remembered the Piasa long after the paint had faded from the stone. Why did the creature need to be painted so high, so visibly, above one of the continent's great waterways? What was it meant to communicate to those who passed beneath it? The Illinois oral tradition offers one answer, though, as with most stories carried across generations, the details shift depending on who is telling it. In the more elaborate retellings, the Piasa becomes an active threat, a creature that preyed upon nearby villages, carrying off residents until a warrior leader, often named as Chief Owatoga, devised a plan to end its reign of terror. Whether this narrative reflects an older, simpler tradition reshaped by later storytellers, or whether it preserves something closer to an original account, is impossible to say with certainty. What scholars of indigenous art and belief tend to agree on is this: creatures like the Piasa were rarely meant as literal portraits. Across North America, spiritual and cosmological beings were often depicted by combining traits from multiple animals, a practice that let artists communicate ideas no single creature could hold on its own. A human face might signal awareness or intelligence. Wings might suggest passage between the earth and sky. Claws and horns might carry warnings about danger or about forces requiring respect rather than conquest. Read this way: the Piasa is less a monster to be feared than a symbol to be understood, a way of marking the boundary between the known world and everything beyond it. But symbols do not always arrive from nowhere. Could something real have stood behind this one? Some researchers have wondered whether the Piasa preserves a distant echo of animals that once roamed the region. Birds and mammals from a distant era, encountered and then folded into legend as the physical world moved on without them. It is an appealing idea, and an unprovable one. The span of time separating any such creature from the earliest recorded Piasa accounts is vast, and no archaeological find has yet closed that gap. Others look to smaller, stranger inspirations. A large bird of prey glimpsed from below, its shape distorted by distance and light, later reworked through generations of retelling into something far more elaborate than its origin. Still others point toward the river itself as an explanation, not for the creature, but for its complexity. The Mississippi was never merely a boundary, it was a corridor. Nations traded goods, language, and stories along its length for centuries, and the Piasa's unusual composite form may reflect that long exchange, an image shaped not by one culture in isolation, but by many meeting at its banks. And then there are theories that step further from the historical record altogether. Comparisons to dragon legends found across unrelated cultures worldwide, suggestions that such stories might encode memories of something science has not yet accounted for. These ideas remain, by any honest measure, speculative. No bone, no fossil, no confirmed trace has ever placed a creature matching the Piasa's description in the region's past. And yet the image endures. A modern recreation of the Piasa still watches over the Mississippi today, painted onto the same limestone bluffs that held the original centuries ago. A reconstruction of a reconstruction, several times removed from whatever first appeared on that rock face. What did the earliest artists intend for those who looked up and saw it? A warning? A record of something once encountered and never forgotten? Or a deliberate act of imagination meant to mark the river as a place where the ordinary world gave way to something else? The bluff still stands. The river still moves beneath it, carrying the same quiet questions it always has. Birch bark, stretched thin as skin, curls faintly at its edges. In the dim light of a longhouse, it holds a language no alphabet ever taught. Rows of etched figures, spirals, and stick-limbed beings that seem to walk across the surface. Somewhere, a rattle shakes once, twice, then falls silent. This is a Midewiwin scroll, and if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear what it was made to accompany. A song meant only for those who had earned the right to sing it. The Midewiwin, often translated as the Grand Medicine Society, is one of the most sophisticated religious and medicinal institutions to emerge from the Great Lakes region of North America. Practiced primarily among the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa peoples, it wove together healing, cosmology, and social order into a single, structured tradition. And yet, for all that has been documented about its ceremonies, one question continues to resist easy answers. Where did it actually come from? Mainstream historians and anthropologists generally place the Midewiwin's visible emergence sometime in the 17th or 18th century, appearing clearly in written records once European missionaries and traders began documenting Ojibwe life around the western Great Lakes. Its structure, by the time it was observed, was already remarkably intricate. A graded system of initiation, often described as consisting of 4, and in some traditions, 8 degrees, each requiring years of preparation, memorization, and spiritual discipline. Members who reached the highest levels were considered master healers, capable of treating ailments through herbal knowledge, ritual, and what practitioners described as spiritual intervention. The birch bark scrolls, known as wigwa-sabakun, functioned as mnemonic devices, visual aids that helped Midewiwin priests recall complex origin stories, migration accounts, and ceremonial procedures passed through oral tradition. Some of these scrolls describe a great migration story, a journey undertaken by the Ojibwe people from the Atlantic coast, guided westward over generations by a sacred shell, the Megis, that appeared to them in visions, leading them toward the Great Lakes. Here is where the mystery deepens. Because if these origin narratives are taken at face value, they suggest the Midewiwin's foundational knowledge predates its written record by centuries, perhaps stretching back long before sustained European contact. Some scrolls and oral historians describe origins reaching into a distant past, difficult to date with precision, difficult even to place with certainty on a map. Was the Midewiwin then simply the visible surface of something far older, something that had existed quietly for generations before any outsider thought to write it down? Historians who study the migration accounts note something else curious: the specificity of geography. The stories describe distinct stopping points, river mouths, island chains, sacred rapids, locations some researchers have attempted to correlate with real, identifiable places across the northeastern woodlands and the Great Lakes Basin. If the correlations hold, they imply a level of long-distance historical memory that would be extraordinary to preserve without written language. How does an oral tradition retain such precise geographic detail across potentially dozens of generations? Is it possible that mnemonic systems like the birchbark scrolls functioned almost like an external memory archive, capable of preserving detail with a fidelity we still don't fully understand? Then there are the origin stories themselves, not just of migration, but of the Midewiwin's founding. Several traditions describe the society's teachings as gifts bestowed by spiritual beings, most notably a figure often identified as Nanabojo, a culture hero and trickster spirit central to Ojibwe cosmology. In these accounts, sacred knowledge was not simply invented by human beings, but transmitted, handed down through a spiritual intermediary during a time period that resists conventional chronology. Anthropologists tend to interpret these stories symbolically as cultural frameworks encoding real historical experience in spiritual language. But some researchers and many Ojibwe knowledge keepers themselves resist that flattening, arguing that these accounts should be taken on their own terms, as records of an encounter, not merely as metaphor for one. Adding another layer to the puzzle is the practice's remarkable resilience. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, U.S. and Canadian assimilation policies actively suppressed Indigenous religious practices, banning ceremonies, confiscating sacred items, and pressuring communities to abandon traditional spiritual systems altogether. And yet the Midewiwin did not disappear. It persisted, sometimes underground, sometimes reshaped, but never fully extinguished. Some scholars point to the strength of its structured initiation system as the reason for its survival. A religion built around transmission, memorization, and internal record-keeping may simply be harder to erase than one dependent on visible public ritual alone. Others wonder whether something else sustained it, a depth of conviction or a resilience embedded in the tradition itself that outside observers have never fully been able to measure. Fringe theories inevitably have crept into the edges of this story. Some speculative writers have proposed connections between Midewiwin cosmology and lost civilizations, ancient transoceanic contact, or hidden pre-Columbian networks stretching across the continent, claims for which mainstream scholarship finds no supporting evidence, and which many Ojibwe scholars firmly reject as distortions of their living tradition. Yet the persistence of such theories says something of its own. That when a tradition's origins remain this elusive, imagination will always try to fill the gap left by uncertainty. What we're left with, in the end, is a religious and medicinal system of extraordinary complexity, whose deepest roots vanish into an oral past that predates the written record entirely. The birchbark scrolls remain, the ceremonies continue in some communities to this day, and the migration stories still describe places that may or may not correspond to real physical ground. But the moment of true origin, the first gathering, the first vision of the Megish shell, the first voice to carry these teachings forward, remains just out of reach. Perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps some knowledge was never meant to be fully excavated by outsiders, only carried forward by those entrusted to hold it. And perhaps the real question isn't when the Midewiwin began, but how much of its original teaching still remains, quietly passed from hand to hand, waiting for those willing to listen. Some miles south, where the birch forests of the Great Lakes give way to red clay and slow-moving rivers, another kind of sacred flame once burned. Not stored on bark scrolls, not sung in longhouses, but tended, literally in the earth itself. Among the Muskogee or Creek Confederacy of the southeastern woodlands, the council fire was not merely symbolic. It was a living thing, fed and guarded at the center of every tawa, or town, and it was never, under any circumstances, allowed to go out. Until, in more places than history can fully account for, it did. To understand the mystery of the vanished council fires, you first have to understand what they meant. Each Muskogee town maintained its own sacred fire, kept in a specially built structure at the heart of the community, often within a square ground, a ceremonial plaza used for governance, diplomacy, and ritual. This fire was considered a direct link to the sun and to the divine order of the cosmos. It was renewed once a year during the green corn ceremony, or poskita, a purification ritual involving fasting, the extinguishing of old fires, and the careful rekindling of new ones, a literal and spiritual reset for the entire community. Old grudges were forgiven. Old hearths were swept clean. The fire's rebirth marked the town's rebirth. Historians and ethnographers, drawing on 18th and 19th century accounts from traders, missionaries, and Muskogee oral historians themselves, agree on this much. The ceremonial structure is well documented. The symbolism is clear. What becomes far murkier is what happened to these fires, and to the towns that kept them, during the region's most turbulent centuries. By the time of forced removal in the 1830s, when the Muskogee people were driven from their homelands along the Trail of Tears, many of these sacred sites were abandoned in haste. Entire square grounds, some maintained for generations, were left behind. Their fires, according to several oral accounts, deliberately extinguished before departure so that no outsider could claim or desecrate them. Others, some traditions suggest, were not extinguished at all. They were simply left burning, entrusted to the land itself, with the understanding that the people would one day return to relight them. Did they? Some did. Some communities in Oklahoma re-established square grounds and rekindled fires using coals or embers carried, town by town, across hundreds of miles. A chain of transmission that some historians describe as one of the most remarkable acts of cultural preservation under duress in American history. But not every fire made that journey. Numerous tawa sites across Georgia and Alabama were abandoned entirely, their locations gradually lost to time, absorbed into farmland, forest, or in some cases, beneath modern towns and reservoirs. How many sacred fires were left behind, unaccounted for? No comprehensive record exists, only fragments scattered across missionary journals, surveyor notes, and the memories of families who carried the stories forward. Archaeologists have since located and excavated a number of these ancient square grounds, uncovering rings of hardened fire-altered earth, soil literally transformed by centuries of continuous burning at the same central point. In some cases, radiocarbon dating suggests ceremonial use extending back not decades, but centuries, layered fire upon fire, generation upon generation, at the very same sacred spot. What does it mean to burn a fire in the same place for that long? What kind of continuity does that represent? And what does it mean when that continuity is severed? Here, the mainstream historical narrative, displacement, disruption, cultural adaptation under colonial pressure, is where most scholarly accounts comfortably rest. But there are other threads, quieter ones, that persist at the edges of the story. Some Muskogee oral traditions describe certain abandoned fires not simply as extinguished, but as fires that were never fully put out. Coals said to smolder, unseen beneath the earth long after the people departed, tended by something other than human hands. Other stories speak of specific square grounds that, even generations later, visitors describe as carrying an unusual charge, an atmosphere that lingers regardless of whether anyone remembers what once stood there. Anthropologists tend to interpret these accounts as expressions of collective memory and spiritual attachment to place, a way of encoding loss and continuity into story. Yet for the communities who tell them, the line between memory and something more literal is not always where outside observers assume it to be. And then there is the deeper question, one rarely asked outright. How far back does this fire-keeping tradition actually extend? The green corn ceremony and its associated square ground design bear striking resemblance to ceremonial patterns found among earlier Mississippian-era mound-building cultures, whose monumental earthworks still rise across the same landscape the Muskogee once called home. Are the sacred fires of the historic Creek Confederacy a continuation of something far older, a ritual inheritance stretching back centuries before European contact, quietly passed down through upheaval, migration, and transformation? Or did the tradition evolve independently, arriving at a similar spiritual solution to a similar human need? The need for renewal, for a fixed point of continuity in an uncertain world? No definitive answer exists. The square grounds that remain active today are cared for with quiet determination, their fires relit each year in ceremonies rarely open to outside observation. And the ones left behind, swallowed by forest, farmland, or floodwater, keep whatever they were tending to themselves. Perhaps that is the nature of a sacred fire, not something meant to be fully explained, only fully kept. And somewhere beneath the red clay of the southeast, in places no map still marks, one has to wonder, how many of those fires are truly out, and how many are simply waiting? 2 centuries would pass before anyone thought to ask what actually happened to the Mascouten, and by then, most of the answers were already gone. Picture a prairie edge in what is now Wisconsin or northern Illinois. Tall grass rolling toward oak groves, the kind of transitional landscape that 17th century French explorers described as neither fully forest nor fully plain. It was here, and across a shifting territory stretching from the western Great Lakes down toward the Wabash Valley, that a nation called the Mascouten once lived. Their name in Algonquian languages has been translated various ways. People of the small prairie, among them, though even that detail carries more uncertainty than most textbooks let on. The Mascouten appear clearly enough in the historical record at first. French Jesuit missionaries and explorers, including figures like Jacques Marquette, documented encounters with them in the mid to late 1600s, describing fortified villages, active trade relationships, and a people clearly enmeshed in the complex web of alliances and conflicts that defined the Great Lakes region during that era. A period historians often call the Beaver Wars, when competition over the fur trade reshaped indigenous political landscapes across the continent. The Mascouten are recorded fighting alongside some nations, warring against others, and shifting their settlements multiple times in response to pressure from the Iroquois Confederacy and the ongoing chaos of colonial trade expansion. And then, by the early to mid-1700s, the references begin to thin. Not disappear entirely, but thin in a way that has left historians debating for generations. The mainstream explanation is, in some ways, unremarkable, at least by the standards of this violent and transformative period. Many scholars believe the Mascouten were gradually absorbed into neighboring nations, most notably the Kickapoo and the Potawatomi, through intermarriage, alliance, and the ordinary pressures of population decline caused by disease, warfare, and displacement. Some historical records do show individuals and family groups identified as Mascouten integrating into Kickapoo communities specifically, and some linguists and ethnohistorians argue the two groups may have already shared close linguistic and cultural ties before this period, making absorption a natural, almost quiet transition rather than a dramatic ending. But here is where the certainty starts to erode. Unlike other nations whose absorption or displacement is documented through specific treaties, mission records, or continuous naming in later historical accounts, the Mascouten seem to fade from written history with unusual abruptness. By the 1760s, references to them as a distinct, separately identified people become exceedingly rare. By the time of major 19th century treaty negotiations in the region, the very documents historians rely on to trace the fates of Great Lakes nations, the Mascouten name has all but vanished from official record, while nations like the Kickapoo, Potawatomi, and Sac and Fox continue to appear clearly, negotiating, signing, and persisting. So did the Mascouten simply cease to exist as a distinct people? Or does their absence from later records reflect something else, a failure of colonial record-keeping itself, rather than a true historical end? Names recorded by French and later British and American officials were notoriously inconsistent, filtered through translation, mishearing, and shifting political convenience. Is it possible that Mascouten identity persisted internally, within absorbed communities, long after outside observers stopped using the name to describe them? Some contemporary Kickapoo oral traditions are said to acknowledge Mascouten ancestry among certain family lines, though this connection has never been systematically studied or confirmed through extensive historical or genealogical research. Archaeology offers fragments, but no resolution. A handful of village sites tentatively associated with Mascouten occupation have been identified through French colonial-era maps and limited excavation, yet none have been conclusively confirmed through undisputed material evidence tying them definitively to Mascouten habitation rather than neighboring or successor groups. The physical trail, much like the documentary one, simply grows thin and then goes quiet. Inevitably, at the fringes of Mascouten historiography, more speculative theories emerge. A few amateur historians and independent researchers have proposed that the Mascouten's rapid disappearance from record reflects a catastrophic, unrecorded population collapse. Perhaps an epidemic more severe and more concentrated than official accounts describe, effectively erasing a nation before colonial administrators had reason to document its end in detail. Mainstream historians generally view this as plausible in degree but unproven in specifics, since precise demographic collapse of this kind is notoriously difficult to verify without direct documentation. Still, the theory persists, in part because it offers an explanation for something that otherwise resists tidy conclusion. What remains, then, is a strange kind of historical silence. Not the loud erasure of forced removal, not the visible continuity of a fire relit generation after generation, but something quieter. A people who were here, clearly and repeatedly documented, and then simply were not, at least not under the name history had given them. Perhaps the Mascouten never truly vanished at all. Perhaps they are still present, folded into other nations, their names simply retired rather than their people erased. Or perhaps something else happened in those thinning decades of record, something the fur traders, missionaries, and colonial clerks were never positioned to see or never cared enough to write down. Either way, the prairie edge where they once built their villages keeps its answer close. And one has to ask, how many nations have slipped through history this quietly, waiting only for someone to notice they were never truly gone? The prairie itself does not stay silent forever. Scattered across that same rolling grassland and across the wider plains stretching west and south from it, lie objects that some believe still carry the memory the written record lost. Smooth, oddly shaped stones, some no larger than a fist, tucked into medicine bundles or left resting atop windswept ridges for generations. To many plains nations, these are known as buffalo stones or iniskim, and their origin is a mystery that predates any single written account. At first glance, an iniskim looks unremarkable, a fossilized ammonite fragment. Typically, its natural spiral ridges worn smooth by time, occasionally bearing a faint resemblance to a small, curled buffalo calf. Geologists can explain the stone's physical formation easily enough. It is the fossilized remnant of an ancient marine mollusk, tens of millions of years old, left behind when much of the interior plains lay beneath a shallow inland sea. Ordinary erosion, ordinary geology. And yet, for the Blackfoot, Cree, and several other plains nations, these stones were never merely geological curiosities. They were sacred, understood as living objects with the power to call the buffalo herds themselves. According to Blackfoot oral tradition, the first iniskim was discovered during a time of great hunger, when the buffalo herds had vanished and the people faced starvation. A woman, some versions of the story say, heard a small voice calling to her from the prairie grass, a voice belonging to a strange stone half buried in the earth. The stone instructed her in a ceremony, a specific song and ritual that, when performed correctly, would draw the buffalo back to the people. She followed the instructions. The herds returned, And from that moment forward, the Iniskim became a central part of ceremonial life, used specifically in rituals intended to ensure successful buffalo hunts. Rituals that, by multiple 19th century ethnographic accounts, were still being actively practiced at the time. European and American observers began documenting Blackfoot religious life in detail. Here, the historical and the unexplained begin to blur together in a way that resists easy separation. Ethnographers such as George Bird Grinnell and later anthropologists documented the specific reverence given to these stones extensively, describing how they were kept wrapped in sacred bundles, passed down through specific families or medicine societies, and brought out only for particular ceremonies tied directly to the buffalo hunt. This part of the record is well established. What resists easy explanation is something more elusive: the sheer consistency of the belief across widely separated Plains nations, many of whom had limited direct contact with one another, yet who independently developed strikingly similar traditions around fossil stones believed to summon buffalo. Is this simply the natural result of shared environment? Peoples living across the same fossil-rich plains, encountering the same ammonite formations, arriving independently at similar spiritual interpretations of similar objects? That is the explanation most anthropologists favor, and it is not an unreasonable one. Human beings across unconnected cultures have frequently assigned sacred meaning to unusual natural objects, particularly ones bearing an uncanny resemblance to living creatures. But why buffalo, specifically, so persistently, across so many different traditions? And why does the specific ceremonial function, calling the herds, ensuring the hunt, repeat itself with such striking similarity from one nation's account to the next, rather than diverging into more varied interpretations, as folklore around ambiguous objects often tends to do? Some researchers who study Plains ethnobotany and material culture have raised another quieter question: whether the timing of Iniskim ceremonies correlates in any measurable way with actual buffalo migration patterns. Whether these rituals, beyond their spiritual dimension, may have encoded practical ecological knowledge, observations about seasonal herd movement passed down through ceremonial structure rather than direct explanation. If so, were the stones themselves less the mechanism and more the vessel? A sacred container for accumulated environmental knowledge that needed a spiritual framework to be preserved and transmitted with sufficient authority across generations? Mainstream anthropology finds this plausible in principle, though difficult to prove with the fragmentary record that survives. At the more speculative edges of this subject, a smaller number of independent researchers and alternative historians have proposed something further still, suggesting that the extraordinary consistency of buffalo calling traditions across the plains points to something beyond convergent cultural development, hinting at older, shared points of origin or transmission between nations that conventional history has not yet mapped. This remains unsupported by mainstream archaeological or linguistic evidence, and most scholars regard it as unlikely. Yet it persists at the margins of the conversation, much like the stones themselves persist quietly in bundles still kept today, out of public view, by families and societies who continue to treat them as sacred. What can be said with certainty is this: the buffalo stones are real, ancient, and geologically explainable. Their spiritual role in Plains ceremonial life is thoroughly documented. And yet the deeper questions, why this particular fossil, why this particular ceremony, repeated with such fidelity across such distances and so many generations, remain open, resistant to the kind of tidy resolution written history usually prefers. Somewhere on the plains today, in bundles kept carefully out of sight, these stones are likely still being kept, still being honored in ways outsiders will never fully witness. And one is left to wonder: when a fossil millions of years old becomes a living part of ceremony passed down for centuries, where exactly does geology end and memory begin? Follow the plains further southwest, past the fossil beds and buffalo trails, to a quarry unlike any other in North America. A place the Sioux, Cheyenne, and dozens of other nations once traveled hundreds of miles to reach, often crossing rival territory under a truce that held even in the middle of open war. This is the Pipestone Quarry of southwestern Minnesota, a place where the earth itself yields a soft blood-red stone found almost nowhere else on the continent, and where, for reasons no single account fully explains, violence was expected to stop. The stone is Catlinite, named after the painter George Catlin, who documented the quarry in the 1830s and helped introduce it to a wider American audience, though indigenous nations had been quarrying it for centuries, if not longer, well before his arrival. Soft enough to carve with hand tools yet durable once finished, Catlinite became the preferred material for ceremonial pipes across a vast stretch of the continent, used in treaty negotiations, spiritual ceremonies, and diplomatic exchanges among nations that otherwise shared little in the way of language, governance, or territory. The pipe itself, often called the calumet in historical accounts, particularly by French traders who first witnessed its use, functioned as something between a sacred object and a diplomatic instrument, its exchange capable of formalizing peace, alliance, or safe passage in ways that treaties written on paper rarely equaled in perceived permanence. What is verified and remarkably well documented across multiple nations' oral traditions and early European accounts alike is this: the Pipestone Quarry itself was treated as neutral ground. Nations who were actively at war with one another, the Sioux and their rivals among them, were said to lay down hostilities upon entering the quarry's vicinity, permitted to gather stones side by side under an unspoken, near-universal truce. Catlin himself described witnessing this arrangement, and multiple oral traditions from Dakota, Ojibwe, and other regional nations independently corroborate the site's unusual sacred neutrality, even though these same groups frequently clashed elsewhere across the same landscape. Why would a quarry, a source of raw material ultimately available in limited quantity to competing nations, become one of the only places on the continent where warfare was reliably suspended? Some anthropologists point to practical explanations. Shared reliance on a resource found nowhere else may have created a mutual incentive for peace, a kind of enforced cooperation born from scarcity rather than pure spirituality. Others argue the opposite direction of causation, that the site's sacred status came first, rooted in origin stories describing the stone itself as formed from the blood or flesh of ancestors, and that practical peace was a downstream consequence of that deeper reverence, not its cause. It is here that the true mystery of this chapter begins. Not the quarry itself, well documented as it is, but a specific pipe said to have emerged from it. Oral traditions among several Plains nations describe an original, foundational calumet, sometimes called a peace pipe of the Confederacies, though the specific name and details shift considerably depending on which nation's account you follow, said to have been carved from the very first stone taken from the quarry, imbued with a binding spiritual authority beyond that of ordinary ceremonial pipes. This object, according to multiple oral accounts, was used to seal an ancient sweeping alliance between several Plains nations during a period of conflict so old that its precise timing has been lost even to oral memory. And then, according to these same traditions, it disappeared. No two accounts agree entirely on how or when. Some describe the pipe being deliberately hidden during a period of increasing pressure from European and later American expansion, entrusted to a specific keeper or family whose identity was meant to remain secret to protect it from confiscation or destruction, a practice with clear historical precedent, since sacred objects across many indigenous nations were frequently concealed during the assimilation-era religious suppression documented earlier in this exploration. Other versions suggest the pipe was broken apart deliberately, its pieces distributed among several nations as a way of ensuring that no single power could ever fully possess the authority it represented. A smaller number of accounts suggest something more ambiguous still, that the pipe was never a single physical object at all, but a title or spiritual role passed between specific ceremonial pipes across generations, its location always somewhat symbolic rather than fixed. Museum collections and private holdings across the United States do contain numerous Catlinite pipes attributed to significant historical figures and treaty ceremonies, some extensively documented, others with provenance far murkier than institutional records tend to admit. Whether any of them represents this specific foundational pipe, or whether such a single object ever existed as a discrete artifact rather than a shifting oral concept, remains entirely unresolved and likely unresolvable through conventional historical methods alone. What remains certain is the quarry itself, still standing, still sacred, still recognized today as a place where the ordinary rules of conflict were once set aside. Whether the specific pipe once carved to seal a lost alliance still exists somewhere, hidden, broken apart, or transformed into something no longer recognizable as its original shape, is a question no single nation's tradition fully answers alone. Perhaps that uncertainty is itself the point. A pipe meant to represent an unbreakable piece may have been deliberately made impossible to fully locate, fully claim, or fully destroy. And if that's true, one has to wonder, is the lost peace pipe truly missing at all? Or is it exactly where its keepers always intended it to be, simply out of reach of anyone still looking?